Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are, dear audience, when you're joining us today for today's session of Berlin Talks, a series of panel discussions on contemporary topics, important issues looked at by experts coming from different sides of issues. And tonight here in Berlin, we have assembled a small panel to discuss the topic gender and the COVID-19 pandemic, lessons learned, with a question mark, and hopefully that question mark will more or less disappear in the sense that we will be able to indicate what lessons may have been learned so far in this pandemic. On behalf of Freie Universität Berlin, it is my pleasure to welcome our panel and you, the audience, to today's session. And I do so also on behalf of the two sponsoring programs. My name is Dirk Verheyen. I'm academic director of one of the two programs, the FUBiS program. The Berlin European Studies program is an international semester program at Freie Universität Berlin with students from abroad who take courses in German language as well as subject courses across mostly the liberal arts, the social sciences, and the humanities. The FUBiS program is the Freie Universität Berlin International Summer and Winter University. It offers a session in January and two during the summer, also involving German language and subject courses. And both programs have a rich cultural framework program for the students that participate. And under normal conditions, at least, several hundred students come to campus to participate in these different programs. We have also offered a number of online courses over the past year, and we have undertaken a number of online projects, and one of them is the Berlin Talks project. So with that, a few technical points to note for the audience. You, the audience, will remain anonymous and invisible during this entire discussion. However, you can participate, and please do so, by inserting your questions in the chat function so that we can see those and share them with the panelists towards the end of the discussion, of the panel discussion. And with that, it is my pleasure to introduce our three panelists for tonight. Dr. Regina Frey is a political scientist and policy advisor for the implementation of gender equality strategies. She runs the Gender Institute for Gender Equality Research in Berlin. Her main focus areas are gender mainstreaming, gender budgeting, gender in organizations, and gender assessment of policymaking. After graduating and working as a lecturer and researcher at Freie Universität Berlin, Dr. Frey founded the Gender Office in Berlin in 2002, offering social science research and advice, as well as further training in the political field of gender equality. From 2009 to 2014, she was a partner in the Agency for Equal Opportunities in the European Social Fund, ESF. The agency accompanied the implementation of gender mainstreaming in the federal program of the ESF, including the implementation of gender budgeting in the fund. From 2015 to 2020, she headed the office for the third gender equality report of the German federal government. Today, Dr. Frey is a senior consultant for UN Women, the environmental agency of the German federal government, and the Institute of Economic and Social Research. Professor Dr. Holger Bonin is the research director of the IZA Institute of Labor Economics in Bonn, here in Germany. He teaches as professor of labor market and social policy at the University of Kassel and is also a member of the Commission of Experts for Research and Innovation established by the German federal government. His empirical research focuses on the impact of digital progress and demographic changes on employment and working life. He also evaluates the effects of social policy measures, in particular in the realms of active labor market policy and family policy. Besides his research, Dr. Bonin is very committed to academic policy consulting. He has served in the Independent Expert Commission for the second Gender Equality Report of the federal government, for example, and is a member of the board of experts of the skilled worker monitoring system established by the Federal Ministry of Labor and Social Affairs. Professor Bonin is an elected member of the Economic Policy, Social Policy, and Population Economics committees within the German Economics Association. And our third panelist is Dr. Kai Overmann. He is head of the Junior Research Group Time Policy at the German Institute for Economic Research, DIW, in Berlin. The interdisciplinary research group analyzes time policy as one element of social policy. Time policy allows individuals and households to cope with time conflicts during critical phases in their employment biographies. It includes measures and benefits that enable employees to use their time resources according to their preferences, irrespective of their income. Gender issues are an overarching theme in the work of the research group. Dr. Mueller holds diploma degrees in political science and economics and a doctoral degree in economics. He studied at Freie Universität Berlin and at Humboldt-Universität Berlin and worked earlier in his career at the Berlin Social Science Center. Since his doctoral studies, he has been employed in the public economics department at DIW Berlin. His primary research interests encompass labor and family economics, social policy, and applied econometrics. A welcome to our panelists. And before we come to an opening question to start off the discussion, I would like to share with them and with you, the audience, several slides, as is our custom, to simply give you a sense of introduction and some visuals before we get to the discussion. The first slide is taken from a report that was produced for the European Commission in May of 2020, supervised by Sabine Oertelt-Prigione, who is at a university in the Netherlands. And the report was entitled "The Impact of Sex and Gender in the COVID-19 Pandemic." And what this image here, this picture shows us is the pandemic having an impact in different areas, having relevance in different areas. And the 5 that were selected for this report were the economy, politics, the question of care, the question of violence, and the question of innovation. And basically, these are questions that were raised in that context. For example, with the economy, who are the essential workers? Which industries will suffer as a result of the pandemic? When it comes to politics, who manages the response? By what standards? What measures are undertaken? What decisions are made? What priorities are set? The question of innovation, perhaps particularly in the area, for example, of the pharmaceutical industry with the search for medication. Which innovation areas are funded? Who can innovate? And the question of gender in that context. And then the question of care, which will come up rather prominently tonight. Are care needs considered in emergency response? Who manages this increased care need as a consequence of the pandemic? And then a sad topic that has also gotten some attention in coverage in the news, the question of violence, including domestic violence. Who is safe during the quarantine? Is there a gender factor here that we need to be aware of in terms of the domestic tensions that have resulted in many households as a result of the pandemic? So this is, as a starter, a sense of the kind of agenda that one is facing when dealing with the impact of the pandemic. Now, this next chart basically shows the number of coronavirus cases in Germany in 2021 by age group and by gender. And so you can see that the predominance of cases lies between 15 and 60 years of age. On the face of it, it looks like it is a roughly equal number of men and women in the broad sense. One of the things that the graph does not show, which is often pointed out, is that slightly more women contract the virus, but more men are likely to die from it. There seems to be a discrepancy there. We will not be getting really into any kind of medical discussion tonight, but at least this gives you a picture there. So the question of the impact of COVID-19 on men and women being different is something that, for example, the Department of Economic and Social Affairs at the United Nations has also been looking at. And so here they conclude women above age 20 appear more likely to be diagnosed with COVID-19, while men in all age groups under the age of 80 are more likely to die from it. And so you see here that conclusion that I had just mentioned before. And the next thing that the slide shows is very important. Women account for 70% of health and social workers. This is an issue that will come up, obviously, in the discussion tonight because of the implications that that has for us as a society. And then we have here something that the European Union put out, women and men in precarious jobs. 84% of working women between the age of 15 and 64 are employed in services including the main COVID hit sectors, childcare, retail, and hospitality and tourism. Okay. And if you look further at this information here, you look at inactivity in the labor market due to caring responsibilities in EU countries. For about a third of women, that has been a consequence in one way or another in this pandemic, but only for about 5% of men. So already there, we see a clear contrast. Also, if you look at the rate of part-time employment in the EU, almost a third of women tend to be employed part-time, which is true only for less than 10% of men. I mentioned earlier the care professions, the frontline workers, the care sector, and the sales sector in the EU. Women make up 95% of domestic cleaners and helpers, 93% of childcare workers and teachers' aid, 86% of personal care workers in the health services. This is, again, a very important thing to keep in mind, and 82% of all cashiers. So lockdowns, crises in hospitals, in nursing homes, and so on. All these things impact women quite directly, also in the workplace, because so many of them are employed in these sectors. And then we have a figure here from a report entitled Women's Work, Housework, and Childcare Before and During COVID-19, which was published in June of 2020 by the Center for Economic Policy Research here in Europe. And it shows the percentage of working women and their partners by working arrangement during the emergency. And so if you look at working women, 23% were, at least initially, working at the usual workplace, but that was true for up to 1/3 of the working partners. Working for home, you see the number shooting up in terms of women working from home. And then if you look at the right-hand side, not working because of the emergency, 33%. So if you add those two, working from home or not working at all in career jobs because of the pandemic, you're talking about something like 3/4 of the female population. And then we have something from Eurofound in 2020. The percentage of women and men with young children experiencing work-life conflict. There was surveys carried out, and the respondents were asked to take a stand on these issues. And so you see that women more than men would respond that it was hard to concentrate on the job because of family complications and requirements and responsibilities. The question of the family preventing giving time to the job was something that about 1/4 of the sample of women responded to. And so you can see the further statements that the respondents were asked to evaluate. What you see in general is that women see more of the complications, experience more of the complications involving work and daily life, home life, household, and so on. And finally, as I mentioned, one of the issues that has gotten some attention is the question of violence against women. And this particular graph also, this figure includes children as well. This is something available at the Library of Parliament in Canada, just to take something from overseas. And you see that there are 9 connections, pathways here that can lead to violence, particularly enhanced during a situation of pandemic. If you look at number 2, the quarantines and social isolation, the virus-specific sources of violence, and so on. Violence perpetrated against healthcare workers, that also is an issue that can come up. So this is one of the shadow sides of the pandemic, is the violence side. And a lot of it is hidden because it is in private sphere. And so I wanted to make sure that we include this unfortunate issue, but to be really comprehensive, we need to be aware of this as well. So those are some opening images. And now I would like to pose an opening question to our panelists. And none of the 3 panelists are media experts, but we are all, as citizens, consumers of the media. And of course, we are dependent on the media for the reporting on what government does, what the medical community is saying. There is fake news, there is conspiracy theories, there's all this debate about what's going on. And so my question to our panelists is, from your personal, as a citizen, and professional point of view, because the lens that you wear when reading or watching news and so on, what is your sense of the role of the media in this pandemic? Where do you see strengths and weaknesses, problems, and so on? And I will begin by turning over the floor to Dr. Frey.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you for inviting me for this interesting panel discussion. And the first question Mr. Verheyen asked is, well, as he already said, I'm not a media expert, but okay, as a citizen, maybe I can try to give my point of view. It's, well, for me, it's like the media is the media, and the media isn't science. And I think it's interesting to see how media is going into the knowledge of science and presents scientific knowledge to the public, and how this has been translated, and how complexity has to be reduced to a headline, you know. And I think that's a challenge, and I think some of the media is doing a good job, and some well, media actors do not do a good job. On my topic, because, well, I'm an expert on gender equality, as you said, I have to say, okay, there were some media reports I thought they were quite nice, and, well, really also going into the studies and reporting on gender equality. A lot was reported on the unequal division in families when there was a lockdown and the kindergarten schools were shutting down. And there were facts and figures that were also really in the media, which I think is nice. And on the other hand, you also have this kind of very, very simplifying headlines, just saying, okay, gender equality is now like there's a huge backlash, and well, this is maybe too simple and too much, I think. But all in all, I think the media plays its role, and I think it's really important that we have the discussion on, well, the role of the media and how scientific knowledge and the transfer of scientific knowledge into a wider public can be done in a way that it really serves the public, and it's not like dividing the wider public. So that's my point of view and what I can see also in what has been reported on gender equality issues.
Thank you very much, Dr. Frey. Dr. Bonin, what is your sense of the media? How do you, as a consumer of the media and as an academic, as an analyst, look at this?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. Great pleasure. Well, I must say I'm not an ardent user of the media, I would say, perhaps. So I'm a very selective view on the media. So I don't watch television. I'm not very active in social media and so forth. So I have a very, very limited view on, let's say, high quality media. So that's definitely a biased thing because that's very important, because there are things happening, let's say, in the tabloid press and so forth, which I don't even perceive. As a researcher, I mean, we've got a lot of attention also with our institute with anything which is related to forecasting the pandemic. I mean, we are not epidemiologists, but we are economists, and we've done a lot of studies. I mean, we also have a study which is right now in the media, very important. It's about the reopening of schools and the importance, basically, to open up the schools combined with tests, because that reduces the spread of the pandemic. And we have very, very clean evidence on that following the reopening of the schools and after the summer break. So that gets a lot of attention, and there's a lot of, and it's a positive thing that media have basically caught, I mean, have tried to bridge this gap between, well, these very complex research affairs and basically what it means to be individual beings, because that's very, very crucial in this pandemic. I mean, the pandemic is affecting, I mean, everybody at a very, very, very personal level, and the way what we know and how we design and how we deal with the pandemic is very much governed by scientific considerations. When it comes to the topic of gender, I mean, I'm with Regina Frey, what she said, but I also think there is what we see as a typical middle class bias. So much of what catches the attention of the media and the journalists is basically reflecting their own view. So we've seen, I would say, a lot of attention paid to well, conditions in the home office, because every journalist is in a home office. We've seen much less about the working conditions of care workers, about the conditions of single mothers within the home office, which is perhaps a totally different affair. And basically, so I mean, that's a typical thing which we've seen in many kind of reports, but this has been present, and this also biased a little bit well, the overview and on gender inequality issues during the pandemic, I would say.
Thank you very much. Dr. Mueller, your take on this issue of the media?
Yeah, good evening, and thank you for having me on this distinguished panel. I can follow up on Ms. Frey and Mr. Bonin. I also think, in principle, so quality media is providing a nuanced and good coverage of these issues. On the other hand, being a scientist and knowing how media works, especially mainstream media and large media, or let's say main media coverage, always reduces complexity, and that's the same with the pandemic, focusing on single indicators like incidence rates all the time and leaving aside other important facts. So that is one thing. I agree that in principle, if one wants to get informed, one gets a whole array of different information on specific issues, but these are not covered in the main newsreel in the evening, for example, Tagesschau or ZDF Nachrichten, for example. But in daily newspapers, all of our studies that deal with important issues like the effects on the self-employed, on gender, on home office for different types of employees and people, that gets transported as well. But I would also I would agree that this the complex nature of those problems does not come across to the mainstream audience of the media. But that's not a specific problem of the pandemic. That's an everyday issue that we come across when we try to transport our information to the media and to the public. So that was my first take on this.
Thank you very much. So we started by being consumers of the media, of news, and our sense of that. Now, on the other hand, we are also on the receiving end, of course, as citizens, on the receiving end of government policy. And I might point out here that in an international perspective, when it comes to German government policy during this pandemic, for example, because I deal a lot with people from the United States, they tended to see Merkel as a natural scientist, as a manager type because of her scientific bent, as a good kind of leader to have during a pandemic. They were contrasting that, of course, with Trump a lot of times, these American friends and colleagues. But yet at the same time, also Germany is very organized. The idea that Germany tends to be a culture and a society that's very organized in its approach to things and very methodical, but ranging all the way to questions being raised whether the government might overreach and whether there may be elements of an authoritarian personality in Germany again that could come into play into government policy. So my next question to all three of you is, what about government policy? And I want to start there with Dr. Frey again, because just today you released a report together with others that was put together that provides a critical evaluation of government policy in the context of the pandemic. So Dr. Frey, I'd like to start with you so that you can maybe introduce our audience to this report and some of its main conclusions, and then we will again go around and have the other two panelists also give their sense of the nature of government policy in the context of this pandemic and, of course, of the gender question.
Yeah, thank you. So this is now really a difficult job for me too, because the study has been published today, and the study also is kind of complex, and I also have to reduce complexity at this point. But well, to put it in a nutshell, the policy of the federal, we were looking at the federal government policy measures. This policy was almost completely gender blind. Although in Germany there are regulations for doing, for example, a gender impact assessment on legislation. You have this already, and well, you also have the regulation that well, still gender mainstreaming is a principle of our government, but you have it on paper. And if you really have a look on what has been done to overcome the crisis, you can't see this really, because there was almost no consideration of the impact of the crisis on gender equality. And as you showed us the slides beforehand, well, and we really have evidence that unequal power relations that were also there before the crisis. We have a huge gender pay gap in Germany. We have a care gap in Germany. Mr. Bonin was part of the commission they invented the gender care gap. So we have all the evidence of inequality even before the crisis. We have the evidence and many studies on the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the social life of men and women, clearly showing that in average, women had to suffer more and were affected negatively, not always and not in any regard, for sure, but in the end of the day, you have this picture and you have the numbers. And what the government then did was we had a look at 3 big packages with 108 policy measures, a a huge range of measures, also like not only the child bonus or something, some measures for self-employed persons, but only they put into this method as a stimulus package for the economy, things like credits for the economy or investment in and restructuring, digitalization, a lot of money, also the electrification of mobility. So not really directly addressed to the effects of the crisis. And well, I don't want to question that it is necessary to do this stimuli for the economy because the economy as such suffered. But if we do it in a gender-blind way, there is the danger that that gender inequalities will raise, and I think really we have shown that this has happened. For example, we had a look at employment effects. And on the long run, it is like, okay, there's a lot of money going in infrastructure and in and the restructuring economy, where you have, well, a lot of male jobs, certainly. And if you compare this, the investment in the care economy and in the public sector and the health sector, it's really, well, not a lot of money, you know. And if you compare these figures, you can really ask yourself, okay, that was a response to a crisis, and we have all the knowledge on the essential workers, for example, in the health economy, but the measures didn't target on this kind of crucial areas of the economy. And okay, there really you have a bias, and we have now, well, our lesson learned for the study is that it's really necessary to do this kind of impact assessment before or in planning policies, the policy measures, and not afterwards, then finding out, okay, there is this bias. Maybe I can talk about this more in the course of the evening, because I think it's a lot of information at this point, and I leave it to that.
Thank you. Let me now turn to Dr. Mueller then, in terms of government policy. You just heard what Dr. Frey observed. I would add there, maybe insert the question in there, is this a matter of the government period, or is it also different depending on the political parties involved? Could the next government be expected to act differently based on what we know about their programs and their orientation? Dr. Mueller.
Yeah, let me zoom out first and give kind of a general perspective on this, purely from my personal opinion, because I haven't personally done research on the political science aspects of these questions. But what is apparent to me is that there's, in the medium or long term, not really an organized permanent approach to this crisis management. There's no action or crisis management committee, something like that, and that may point to structural problems in Germany. We always have this Bund-Länder-Runden, which are also a bit seen, are criticized because they are not fully have no full legitimization. But that's one weak point. We have more or less an ad hoc approach and no systematic approach to solve this crisis. Following up on what Ms. Frey said, and these, for example, gender issues related to this crisis, my take would be that most of these things, like the gender care gap, the gender pay gap, are very large structural problems in our society, and you cannot expect, and the crisis enhanced those structural problems, and it's really, it would be too much to expect that we find an immediate solution for these issues. At the same time, I fully agree that political actors and politicians failed to meet some of the most urgent needs of specific groups. And Holger Bonin, in his initial statement, hinted to some of those specific particular groups that are hit hardest and did not only not get media coverage, but did not receive enough support from the government, like specific types of the self-employed, specific types of people in system relevant occupations and stuff like that. So that would be my second point. And very quickly answering your question that you posed to me about the next government. Certainly, there's in terms of gender awareness, one would expect that a center-left government should do more in this area, but we will see if they live up to that. And I think the last time there was a red-green coalition, you could see that some regulations changed and some initiatives were started. But I hope that this will happen. But so the start is not the best because coalition talks last quite long, and in the meantime the crisis has reached new levels, basically. So I'm still a bit skeptical.
Thank you. Professor Bonin, you are an economist, but let me have you address the politics of all this. As an economist, how do you evaluate the operation of the policy-making machine here in Germany on the federal level in this crisis?
Well, I mean, when we talk about policymaking, I mean, we have to really, I mean, distinguish certain areas, right? I mean, we can talk about handling the pandemic itself, or where we're handling the economic crisis. As an economist, I want to talk about the economic crisis. I mean, I agree with Regina Frey when she said that there's certainly not a gender dimension, basically, when we're discussing basically the stabilization measures. I mean, not only Germany, but every affected country in the world has perceived, well, a very massive drop of economic activity. And an important point there is that you are quick. And Germany has been relatively quick with stabilization measures because they have used established measures, which were established. The most important one has been short-term work arrangements. It's very different when you look at the European level. Certain countries, like especially in the south of Europe, didn't have established short-term work schemes, and the European Commission has invested a lot of funds basically to provide Italy, for example, with these kind of short-term work schemes. So when we think about these short-term scale, so these are totally gender neutral in the sense, first of all, that the rules are the same for everybody, but the people who are affected is very different. And that's really complex. Who has been affected by the crisis? It's not a simple gender divider. We can say, okay, services, I mean, the special nature of the crisis is, I mean, or I should say, the short-term work schemes in the past have basically been very much addressed workers in industry. Workers in industry are mostly male, well, I mean, people at Volkswagen or something. Now we have a crisis which has affected industry and services at the same time. But within services, we have very much a segmentation. It hasn't basically put caregiving women into short-term work schemes, but it has put women in the let's say in the restaurant sector or in certain parts of the service industries affected in job. The same way for men. We have very many basically disadvantaged men doing delivery kind of jobs, for example, which are male dominated, which have been affected, but haven't been affected with basically the necessity to get short-term work. So the structure of where people are affected is very different. It's very complex, even when it comes to the target groups of the short-term work schemes. And then there's another dimension, and that's basically what you also captured in your introductory slides, who is basically not reached by these kind of arrangements. There's people who are basically atypical kind of jobs. In Germany, is this very minor jobs, with secondary jobs, which are very much taken up by women, and they don't have access to these kind of schemes. Kai Mueller was mentioning the self-employed workers. Yeah, that's much. There wasn't any kind of automatic system which you could basically inflate. You had to invent one. And in this very short-term inventions phase, it was difficult basically to take into account and start up basically a gender budgeting first, because you had to be very quick. And you didn't really manage to establish these schemes. You were talking about, well, Germany is good at administration in certain areas, but we're not very good, basically, when we develop these schemes. So short-term work schemes has been the dominant part of short-term stabilization when it comes to income stabilization of the individual affected workers. And that has been very successful. But in other areas, we haven't been so good administrative-wise and also design-wise, basically, to compensate certain problematic areas, which has not only affected women, but also men. In the second phase, and that's basically what we're discussing now, is basically thinking about the recovery and restructuring. I mean, I'm a little bit skeptical that you, in a most severe crisis, that you basically should try to do both things. I mean, we have also the discussion, should become a more climate-friendly society now. I mean, again, there hasn't been nothing invented really new. I mean, you were mentioning that we are now working in e-mobility and so forth. I mean, these are all plans which have been basically already on the table, and they basically added the money to them and claim that as basically recovery money. It's not really recovery money. And they also said, okay, it's fine if after the crisis we come out with a new economy. But if we really have a crisis, it's probably not the time to work dominantly on the structural changes, because it weakens the economy and it limits the resources basically for future recovery plans. So in this case, there hasn't been any gender discussion, but it's not a crisis problem. It's the problem that these long-term transformation plans in the German context are very much industry-driven, and as it's industry-driven, high-tech driven, it's not favoring women. And final remark about this, yes, we have seen certain, well, I would call that symbolic improvements when it comes to care workers. I mean, there's been a bonus, Corona bonus paid to women, not to women, but to caregiving workers, but has been very limited, and there hasn't been a good plan, basically, how the recovery, I mean, once the crisis is over, how we would basically develop the healthcare system.
I want to pick up on the theme of the care professions that already has come up, and perhaps begin by posing the question: to what extent this unprecedented health crisis, because at the core, of course, that's what this pandemic is, has put the spotlight on the care professions in a way that normally would not have happened before. And I would like our panelists to address this question as to whether this focus on the care professions has really the potential to bring about structural and positive change, also in light of what has already before the pandemic been, a series of structural problems and discriminatory situations in terms of pay gaps and so on, and lack of recognition of many in the care fields, or to what extent after the pandemic there's a risk of falling back into previous patterns along the lines of, okay, we overcame the pandemic, let's go back to business as usual. So to what extent is this pandemic putting the focus on care professions in a way that could be beneficial? And are we really going to come out of this with positive changes? What does it take to get to that point? And I start again with Dr. Frey.
Yeah, thank you. Before I go into the care sector, I'd really like to reply to Professor Bonin and Dr. Mueller, because, well, as you said, well, it had to be quick. I'm very aware of, well, okay, there was an immediate crisis, and the government had to react quickly. But to be true, I don't see that as an excuse in a way to really neglect gender issues in what they did, because you have a government, you can do that very quickly, you can do a gender impact assessment. And well, I did this study analyzing 108 measures in a very short time. And I think as a state, you can organize this kind of short analysis on the impact. And yes, of course, it's structural, and you cannot solve structural problems with this crisis mechanisms. I'm also totally aware of this, but we can maybe talk about, well, innovation in a way, because, okay, the first package was already prepared, and then we just gave the money to, well, the plans were already there. But I'm not so sure whether that is a very smart way to do things in a way. And I think the point that expertise was not organized, and also expertise could not really influence these measures. I think that's really a failure. Yes, it had to be quick, and yes, it was very, nobody knew what was really coming. I'm very aware of this, but I think it's not an excuse for this kind of well, not only gender blindness, but as the colleague said, no structural approach to any of this. And for example, with the I also totally agree with Holger Bonin that the short-term schemes for workers, that was a success story in Germany. But at the other hand, you have this gender bias within this kind of regulation, because the amount of money is assessed with the netto income, and we in Germany have this kind of weird thing, the tax system, splitting system for married couples, which makes one salary, the netto salary, very, very low. And if you don't change this, and that would have been easy to change, because you have just another kind of, well, assessing the income, that would have been a solution for this, and it would have been easy, you know. And that was really a gender bias that hit women much harder than men. Yeah, and also maybe the question of precarious jobs, especially in some branches like hotels, restaurants. There's a lot of, well, what we call mini jobs, not socially, with no social security, or no real social securities, and also this kind of jobs, what now the new government is talking about is to extend these kind of mini jobs. And this is really the totally wrong direction, because in all of the gender equality reports, there was, well, mini jobs, women are trapped in these mini jobs together with other disincentives for more employment, and the government does the contrary. So I'm not sure whether our new government has understood the consequences of this, really. Okay, maybe that was that, and now about the care economy, because and I maybe can add here, the care economy is an economy that is totally neglected by economists, because it seems to be not a real economy. But there are studies from the UK saying if you invest in the care economy and in care workers and create better jobs in the care economy, you can really create employment. And for example, one study said you can create more jobs than if you invest in the construction industry. And there's a need, because also of the demographic change, of more care work, better paid care work, better job conditions. That was before the crisis already, and now we can see this. What I also can see, and that was also in my study, is that the care work is not considered really. And it's still like, okay, we don't take it seriously economy-wise, because it's only like, okay, jobs that also can be done for free in a way. And I really think that is a big challenge. And the small bonuses that went to the professional care workers it's really not a structural a structural thing to do with these jobs. And the unpaid care work as well. Okay, there was some idea on, well, compensating for the unpaid care work in the families. But for example, care work for elderly people, nobody really was talking about this. The care work for elderlies in the families at home, I think there were so many problems there, and this was well, no issue in the media. I think that was not a topic at all, and also for policymakers that wasn't considered. So the care sector still, I think, is I think it's really what we need to strengthen in the future, but it's a non-topic in my view still, and I don't understand that.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Mueller, has there not been the proper structural focus on the care sector, which would have been possible, particularly in the context of a pandemic? Is this an opportunity that's already being missed? What is your take on this?
Well, from my perspective, I'm not an expert for professional care, but this is also very much a long-term problem. Anecdotally, when I was a civil servant and I worked in a hospital, there were the same problems like 20 years ago. Like the pay was too low, the workload was much too high. So I worked basically as a full-time health worker at the time. I wasn't qualified to do that. But on the other hand, I can contribute some empirical facts. As far as I know, there are differences between, for example, healthcare workers whose pay level is not as low as, for example, elderly care people working in professional elderly care. So there's a larger gap between the average salary and the salary earned there. But it's also a question of prestige or recognition of these jobs, and it's also obviously a question of working conditions. But I have to admit, I'm not sure what the solution could be, except for like symbolic things Holger Bonin talked about, and I might leave it to him to answer the structural questions, whether in our current system there would be enough incentives generated to really improve on salaries and working conditions, stuff like that. I'm not sure about this. Certainly, long term, we have an increasing demand in those services because of demographic change. Everybody knows that, and we're running. I mean, the reality is that we have an informal sector, at least in elderly care in Berlin. Like I have no idea about the numbers, but the share of unofficial workers is quite high. So definitely, the opportunity to recognize that or to make this more public has not been taken up so far. But this is not a problem of the crisis. The crisis only brought that up again. And I think we need to work on those medium and long-term solutions, especially in light of the changing demographics.
Thank you. Professor Bonin, is the care economy not taken seriously enough by you professional economists?
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, and the care economy is a heterogeneous one. I think we talked about the informal living in arrangements of a non-professional caregiving is very different. I think that is pretty much understudied. I'm pretty sure. I'm not so sure about the health system. I mean, health economists should know something about this. I mean, when it comes to the crisis, I mean, I don't want to talk much about. I mean, I perfectly agree with Regina Frey was saying about the informal care arrangements. It was a disaster, but we know from we have several studies looking at the psychological effects on people who basically in households, in private households. Another issue is, and that will be on the agenda of the new government, certainly, is living in arrangements where people come from Eastern Europe and basically informally or less informally. There has been a recent important court rulings saying that these people should get the minimum wage for a 24 hours period. But the crisis has basically disrupted the supply of these workers because the borders were closed. So there's something which, and there will be learning effects. And that's something one shouldn't underestimate. People respond to the experiences of the crisis. There will be something which is also relevant within the context of the professional care givers. We've heard now we have a problem with caregiving for the people who are basically very serious in hospital because people withdrew from the job in response to the crisis. So what can we do? I mean, first of all, it's not all about money. It's very important. I mean, from when we look at the professional caregiving sector, the working conditions are not just money. We have basically pushed up wages, and we have basically in the sector in recent years by not spectacularly, but at least above the average. So, but what we haven't changed so much is, for example, things like how you working hours arrangements, the flexibility of shift work. And there's been very, very conservative and very much in hospitals, for example, the male-dominated leadership structures. We have a discussion about the feminization of medicine, and it's not discussed in a positive way. It's discussed in a negative way because now all these women, doctors and nurses, want to work part-time, and there's no response with the living arrangements. So I think with the working time arrangements. So I think there can be organizational innovation. And one push where I see something in response of the crisis that could happen, at least in the German context, is digitalization in health services. We've learned, we must learn that Germany hasn't been very good in digital health service and e-health, and it has been a disadvantage. We have, I mean, in Spain, you could basically inform the people who need to get vaccinated via mobile phones. That wasn't possible in Germany. We don't even have the data to do that. So, and you don't have the structures. So that could be something, because if you increase productivity in health, then wages will go up in the longer term as well. I see risks, serious risks, where we don't have the money to improve. I mean, I was saying at the beginning, it's not just all about money, but of course there is also money involved. And the budgets to invest in any kind of structural change in the future will be much smaller. And then there's a question, and then I'm back to Regina Frey's initial statements, where we think about the future. I mean, what kind of structural change do we want in the future? I mean, then we have to make a decision. We cannot do both, given limited budgets. Do we want to invest in industry, industrial transformation, in digitalization, in e-health? And I'm not sure in this discussion that the answer will be health services and care services. And I mean, voters have to say could say a lot of things there, but it hasn't been a prominent element, for example, in the recent election campaign. So I mean, one must wonder why that's the case, because people care a lot about healthcare, and there's also substantial willingness to pay, but politicians do not seem to respond as they should.
Thank you. Perhaps I can turn back to Dr. Frey for a moment, if you want to comment a bit more on what you've just heard from the economist point of view also, in terms of the healthcare and gender question. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I very much agree to what Holger Bonin says, because, well, the ideas on it's not all about money, it's on organizational change, the shift work to be reorganized to make these jobs more attractive. I think that's a good way. Also, the education, the re-evaluation of, well, what is it worth to be a care worker? I think that's crucial, and I think there are some innovative, well, ideas on how to solve the problem. But what we have seen in the crisis, and I again refer to my study, is that we had a big package for hospitals. And there was also the digitalization of hospitals, but these measures were mainly measures introducing technological solutions and construction in hospitals. And then there was also this bonus for the care workers, but that was it. And what we have now and what we see now is that, well, we have the infrastructure in the hospitals, but we don't have the personnel. And you have this bias now. And okay, maybe I'm demanding too much from policymakers, but I think if we would have done that last year, even starting to re-evaluate, to think about the working conditions and to get to new ideas, maybe it would have been better now, and maybe not so many health workers would have quit their jobs, but I don't know. Yeah, for that, for now.
I want to add one point, if I may, and that is, I mean, one problem with the care sector is that it's too many women. I mean, we have basically, it would help if we could bring more men into the sector. I mean, not because, I mean, not because of, it's also because, I mean, that would be a signal that we are improving, that we make the sector more attractive in a sense. I mean, this is, yeah.
Historically, is every time when men entered a certain sector of the labor market, the payment raise, yeah. Because of that.
But it's not because of that. I mean, it would tell us that we make the sector more attractive in a certain way, and that basically so especially at the same time, I mean, if it's just a risk of a cluster, right? If it's not something which is always if women are clustered in a certain industry and that industry is affected, I mean, that's very risky, right? I mean, they don't have a choice basically to move somewhere else. I mean, that's true for men as well. But I mean, that's something we should aim at if we think in the long term. I mean, if you want to reduce gender risk induced by any kind of pandemic solution or any kind of great economic crisis, I mean, then it's much better if you get a more less gender segregated labor market. And the care sector is one of the areas where we see this segmentation very much.
But this also goes for the other sectors, also for the IT sector and so on, and where we have some kind of programs, for example, to diversify jobs. And in Germany, the horizontal segregation of the labor market, meaning that you have a lot of jobs where you can find more than 70% of only one gender. This is a structural problem as well in Germany, and well, there are some kind of projects like, okay, making natural science and MINT more attractive for women, and you also have you had a project, for example, in the ESF for making the educational sector or for kindergarten jobs more attractive for men. So we have this, but well, I don't know, maybe there's also other factors that we cannot see real structural changes in this regard.
Let me jump in here because your back and forth already pointed in a direction where I want to go with the next question. And that is the question of gender roles and the relationship, gender relationships. Where I would suggest we can see an intersection of socioeconomic dynamics and sociocultural factors, how in culture and society roles of men and women are defined in a society and interplay with societal economic aspects as well, where we then have to further specify, are we talking about differences among generations in this regard? And how, for example, in a society like Germany or a city like Berlin, does the question of ethnicity and migration play a role here as well in terms of the status of women in particular communities and so on? Now, there is somewhat of a thesis, I believe, afoot in some circles at the present time, that the pandemic may inadvertently lead to what is sometimes called a retraditionalization of gender roles, that certain things that might have been more or less overcome in terms of traditional roles, particularly for women, may, due to the pandemic, be reversed. And so I would like all three of you to address from your particular professional point of view this question of gender roles, gender stereotyping, the relationship between the genders, this question of perhaps retraditionalization. And here I will start with you, Dr. Mueller, if you would like to weigh in on this issue.
Yeah, I will. Let me first to add one thing to the care sector, because we talked a lot about the healthcare sector and already mentioned, as far as I know, so for two reasons, I would like to pledge to also focus the same attention to the elderly care sector. First of all, I think pay level and working conditions are not necessarily better for elderly care or workers in elderly care, professional care. And the second thing, because I worked on this topic in terms of informal care arrangements for elderly care, this is also a highly gendered area, because I think 2/3, 3/4 of this work is done by women, and we see a clear time conflict between working, especially at the end of the working life, and caring for elderly, for partners or for other relatives. And this is for obvious reasons. I mean, during the crisis, these problems have worsened much for people affected by this. So I just wanted to add that, and I think also the demographic change and will lead to more demand for professional and informal care for the elderly. So we shouldn't forget and focus on healthcare only. Coming to your question about gender roles, I mean, from my own research and what I did, and especially my colleagues did with new data, looking at gender roles within families. First thing is we already touched on this. We have a highly gendered labor market. We have a much more gendered care or informal care and housework sector at home. And I have done some research and a recent paper on this, how this inequality restricts or hinders women to enter the labor market or to increase their working hours. It's a big factor that is totally under-recognized also by politicians, as far as I would say. And so this was the reality before, and this was very persistent in Germany. So we have a lot of movement on the labor market in terms of women's employment rates and also to some degree their working hours. But the structure at home is highly persistent in terms of who is doing the housework and who is the primary caregiver for children and also doing elderly care. And so this re-traditionalization is kind of without knowing anything about what the crisis actually did. This is kind of the wrong question, because we were still highly traditional before the crisis. So especially for housework and care work, there is no real re-traditionalization necessary. But what happened during the crisis, as far as I'm aware of that, is that it's also again a heterogeneous picture. We had clearly an increase in care activities for childcare, especially during the lockdown and the closing of schools for women and men. And but again, women are bearing the bulk of this load as before, and increased their hours in absolute terms more than men. We had certain families that had an equal distribution of house and care work before the crisis that also did this during the crisis. And there are certain families where the woman was the only person responsible for these tasks, and this share increased also. So all in all, it hasn't changed much. So there was not a really re-traditionalization, but as I said, it wasn't really. So we were very traditional before the crisis, and that this hasn't changed. And certainly it's not the case that on average that fathers really increased their engagement in these activities.
Okay. Professor Bonin, you're taking this question of the gender
yes. I mean, I agree very much with what was said before. I mean, we've done a survey for the Ministry of Labor. We're running many surveys basically too, as a kind of corona monitoring, asking people every month how they're doing. In example, in the home office, and where we asked women about their view on whether that would be basically lead to retraditionalization home office. And when we're not meaning that that has a long-lasting impact, although they perceived a short-term impact in the sense what's happening when they move to home. I mean, in conjunction with the closure of schools, I mean, there was the additional problems, basically, who takes care of the kids, but there was an additional need to do that. If I think in a longer-term perspective, I mean, now schools are open, things are a little bit changing. There's could create opportunities for women that they can do home office because they're saving time. I mean, an important issue is saving of commuting time. So that adds additional hours. And it's basically, if you ask people what they like about home office, the first thing they say is that there's less commuting. Commuting is it's also for life satisfaction, very important. And we see that could be particularly an opportunity for women. There are risks about this. And because when you think of two people at home, I mean, first of all, who takes care of the housework? But the other aspect is, where do you work? Because most people don't have two offices at home. So, and now we have evidence also from our service that, well, the man has a full office and the woman sits at the kitchen table. And that is an issue where we could think about alternative arrangements. And we've just recently done asked in our survey, would you like to accept the offer of a co-working space, which is between your home and the workplace at your employer? And women, much more than men, preferred basically this third option. Why? Because it basically frees them from the obligations to work at home, and at the same time, it is a time-saving thing if they don't have to commute. So, and there's a discussion. We didn't ask that question just randomly. We asked it because, I mean, the Ministry of Labor in Germany thinks exactly about this now, where we could develop in the countryside more of these kind of co-working working space style opportunities, because that could be something to support women. And that could be a lesson learned, which we've seen in the a lasting change when we think about what Corona did. Because what we see also in these services is that, I mean, before Corona, most people wanted to do home office one day a week. Now, if we ask them, it's something like 2 to 3 days a week. Not permanent, because it deprives you from the connections at the firm, but so that will be a change which is lasting. I pretty much so for those people who can do that. So I mean, in this group of professions where home office is an option, that could be an opportunity for more gender equality. But of course, there are risks. But I mean, probably Regina Frey will say something about the risks attached to that.
Dr. Frey, the question of gender roles, retraditionalization, or perhaps it's not possible because all the traditional stuff's still there in the first place. What's your take on all this?
Well, this is not the area I do really empirical research, but I totally agree to my co-discussions that I don't think that the traditionalization is high as such, because we had very traditional roles before. That's for sure. And I think a little bit of wait and see, because the crisis is not over, and I'm still waiting for, well, what the fourth wave will bring, and maybe that there also will be school closures again, and we don't know that yet. So, and I think that's a dynamic process, and I think the longer it takes, the more maybe then one day we have this retraditionalization. I found the results very interesting, that in egalitarian constellations, in the crisis, the couples remained more egalitarian, and in the traditional settings, the differences are going up. So, and I think that's something that, well, should we have a look at. On a topic on home office or mobile office, as we say, yes, I totally agree. Commuting time is really an advantage, but on the other hand, is really there are studies also saying that it is really stressful. Also, only when there are 2 or 1 day of working at home, because you are distracted and so on. So the question is, what are really the conditions? And I think that's not easy. And I think also home office, in a way, the people who have access to home office are, well, middle class, or they are privileged as such. So it's the question. This question is not tackling some major problem for, well, the women who are the essential workers, who are in the hospitals, who are in the supermarkets. And also, when it comes to home office, one aspect I think we should mention is the career aspect. I think in Germany we still have quite a strong culture of, well, being present in the firm. This has changed in a way with the crisis, because, well, mobile office and home office has normalized, sure. But I still think the way, for example, career is being shaped in enterprises and in organizations, there's a lot of kind of face-to-face networking and informal networking, and also the persons being present and also being available in late hours, as we are now, for example. They have an advantage, and this can't be solved with the home office, and also not being present in the working place can be, in certain settings and in certain organizational cultures, can be of disadvantage for women. So this is, I think, one risk I would like to mention here.
Thank you. The word home office has been used a number of times now, and it brings together 2 concepts, and Dr. Frey, you already alluded to this, that traditionally are seen in their particular categories: home life, privacy, office, and so on. The sense that one wants to have a distinction between the 2, and now the phenomenon of home office, perhaps to some extent an acceleration of trends that may have started earlier and had nothing to do with the pandemic, because they deal with perhaps digitalization and, you know, the availability of internet connections and so on. To what extent has the pandemic led to a situation where the home and home life as a policy focus, as an economic, socioeconomic policy focus, has been discovered or emphasized even more than ever before? And is that a definitive change that we can expect to continue? And to what extent is that kind of focus on the home as an entity of policy an opening for a more gender equal approach to things, because the home traditionally involves a greater focus also on the role of women? Dr. Frey, maybe I can start with you again on that issue.
It's a difficult question, I think. So traditionally, or what we see in gender studies, originally the division of the world in a private and a public sphere is strongly connected to gender patterns. So in the public space, the man, or traditionally the man, is going out to work and being provider for the family, and the women traditionally is in the house. You know, this the division of spheres is mirroring the division of labor in gender equality. And this division now is via home office, kind of the boundaries are blurred, yes. But I don't really know because it's a question of attitudes that you ask, I think, and I don't have an answer for that. Maybe Mr. Bonin, because you did the research on this, didn't you?
Yes, I mean we're observing very closely what's happening over time. I mean, when the pandemic, seemed to improve or over, right? I mean, on the move during the summer months, we've seen that people started returning from home office to their offices, and we also asked them, was that your decision or was that the decision of your employer? And the dominant majority says it was my own decision. And if you ask them why, it's not about career prospects or something. I mean, it's first of all social interaction. That's people appreciate that they meet other people, but it's also that that they don't want, that they want to have strict boundaries between work and home, domestic life. There's a big preference for that, and there's reason for that. I mean, in your introductory slides, you remarked about violence. I mean, the very fact what's happening if people, are sitting, couples are sitting together with each other 24 hours a day for every day, because because they're forced to be in domestic life together, work and spare time together. It's not clear what's doing to relationships. I mean, it must not end in violence, but it could simply add in higher divorce rates and all these kind of things. People may not get involved, get along with each other so well. So there are reasons basically to keep the boundaries. I'm not sure whether that is actually, I mean, you're asking about is the policy to push people into the homes. That's not the case. I mean, much of it is happening basically by private decision making, right? I mean, people started with, policymakers still basically favor right now home office a lot. Yeah, basically in Germany, I mean, the rules basically clearly set that the priority to, if you can, that you should do home office. But people are basically voting by their feet and doing the opposite thing. Also, employers basically have a very, very mixed stance on that. It's not clear that it's good to have only presence culture. Right? I mean, in a situation where we have demographic aging, where the workforce gets scarcer, I mean, everybody says that we must do certain things to make arrangements of family and work better. And one way is to introduce more flexibility, and home office is one way to do it. So ultimately, we will have something like more options, I would say. I mean, not for everybody. That's a serious concern because it will increase additional inequalities in the society. It makes people who are not, I mean, we're talking about middle class phenomenon, everybody can do that, and also in the longer term will not be able to do that. But I think we will see a lot of private arrangements about this, and somehow an equilibrium where we have more options than we had before Corona. It was a push. People invested also in this. They invested in the digital tools to be efficient in home office. They learned how they could basically find new arrangements. So I'm quite optimistic about that. But because we have more diversity of arrangements, and more diversity of arrangements is something which I think is beneficial for women. Yeah, because it reduces the risks, and I mean, we were talking about this when we talk about working time arrangements in care. I mean, that's also, I mean, diversity of arrangements is much more important for women than for men for a long time. So that could be a positive thing about the Corona crisis.
Dr. Mueller, the question of home as an economic, as a societal phenomenon, and its relationship to this pandemic. What is your take on that?
Yeah, I can quickly follow up on both my discussions, because I can reiterate the problem of this dissolution of boundaries and blurring boundaries. A colleague of mine has a research project on this, and there's clear evidence that it does both. It provides more options and more flexibility, and at the same time you have these downsides, right? In terms of stress level, mental health, maybe violence, that are diverse things. And we have empirical evidence even before the pandemic. Just as a side note, very interestingly, if you want to talk about the effects of home office, for example, for the division of housework and also the division of market work, I mean, you rely on pre-pandemic data. It's really scarce, and we couldn't. So we tried to do a study on this, and only with the pandemic you have lots of questionnaires and monitoring about this. So in the ZERP, the German socioeconomic panel, the main household data set, you have only single data points in pre-reform years, and what we find there is the same. Yeah, there's mixed evidence. So women especially use it to do more homework and to do more care work. At the same time, they increase their working time through this and have the opportunity to work a little bit more. But men do the same. The most important thing from the pre-pandemic perspective is that working from home has for a long time been highly selective in Germany, not as a gender thing, but in terms of like the people with higher salaries, the better educated people in the leading position, basically did like 80-90% of the homework. And what we also haven't mentioned in this last round is that there are certain occupations that are suited for homework, for home office or working from home. That should not be forgotten, because this is a huge share of occupations that is doing that. So I agree with. I think there will be a permanent changes, and that this will be a good thing. Where we end up, on which level, and it's a huge impact in the crisis. We have like the last pre-pandemic measure. I know it's like at most 15% of working from home, rather less, and now we have like 30-40%, something like that, numbers like that, and we will see where we end up when we get to the new equilibrium, as Holger Bonin put it. But it will be highly interesting also what this does in the long term for women especially.
Thank you. I'm aware of the time that we have reached. I want to pose a final question and ask each of you to give a hopefully concise answer to that. And that is, in our title tonight is a question, lessons learned, ? And so for each of you, my question would be one lesson that you believe so far, at least in this pandemic, has been learned. That's a positive side. And one key lesson that you feel has not been learned so far. We will begin with Professor Bonin, then Dr. Mueller, and we'll give the final word to Dr. Frey. Dr. Bonin.
Well, difficult question. Lessons learned. But you should be ready to anticipate and to respond to big crises. And what we haven't learned is basically how to be ready. And I'm not sure whether we really will learn and evaluate what we can do how to be ready. This is true for many domains, but also for gender-aware policies.
I don't have probably too good takes on this final question. My lesson learned, going back to the working from home and increasing the options, is maybe that employers in Germany have recognized that more things are possible and more things make sense also for them, especially mobile working and flexible arrangements and less presence culture. So lessons may be learned by employers, leaving out the policy domain, and maybe in terms of lessons not learned, or I still have got the impression that political actors missed out on some really crucial problems. What we haven't talked about today at all is the consequences of school closures and the long-term consequences for certain groups of pupils and children that are don't get enough media coverage and didn't get enough considerations in policy circles, I would say.
Okay, last word. Not easy. I think what we have learned is, again, that gender equality isn't granted in the crisis. Disparities really become visible, and I think to some extent, some people have learned to deal with it and also to create new ideas how to deal with this. And I really hope that this also can give a push for policymakers to have a look at what is happening. I think what we have not learned so much is maybe two things. I think what is really necessary is a more, well, what we always say, intersectional approach. Well, not only looking at men and women, but also really looking at social differences that are entangled. And we had a little bit about migration and class, but well, not really much. And I think this is really something that, well, still remains a challenge. And also then learning from other countries and learning from the international discourse. I think that Germans are kind of resistant of, well, learning from other countries in a way. Sometimes my impression is that the discourse is like, okay, Germans are really coping nicely with the crisis and we have so good tools to deal with it. But I don't think this is the case really, because in other countries or in international organizations, we for example have much better instruments like gender impact assessment or gender markers, and to deal with this kind of policy making. And I think that I really hope that we can still learn from that. Yes.
Thank you so much. I want to thank the three of you for having shared so much this evening. I have a long list of topics. It included education, migration, children, and so on. There's only so much time in hour and a half that we have. So I want to thank our panel for having shared their expertise and their insights on the complexities of this issue of the pandemic and gender, and where we have learned something and where there's still so much more to be done. This concludes the 8th session of Berlin Talks, and it also concludes this series of panel discussions as conceived during this pandemic. Fortunately, at least for the FUBiS program, there again is an on-site program running with students being here, which of course is traditionally what our main focus has been. So next year we hope to come with a new idea. It may look a bit like Berlin Talks. It may also be very different. So we will announce those things on our websites and on our channels at YouTube. Not only the recording of today's session, but all of them, all 8 of them are there for you to view and review over time. They dealt with everything from migration to sustainability, the American elections, 30 years of German reunification, young leaders in the world affairs, and then populism, which was the topic we had in September. So I thank you, the audience, for being so loyal to us, to having joined in this evening and at other sessions. We wish you well. We also are going to show you where you can keep track of us. There you have, for FUBiS and FUBiS, the social media connections, and for all the recordings, you can go to FUBerlin.de/Berlin Talks. With that, take care, stay healthy, and have a good evening. Bye-bye.